If you know one thing about the Vikings, it's probably Lindisfarne. 793, a monastery on a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria and what's now England. Monks killed, treasure taken, the Christian world shocked that anyone would dare touch a holy place. It's a good story, dramatic, clear, a beginning. And for a long time, that's exactly what historians called it, the beginning of the Viking Age. The date every textbook prints, the moment Scandinavia bursts into written history, uninvited, unforgettable. But here's the thing about beginnings, they are rarely where we think they are. I've lived in Sweden long enough now to learn that the stories everyone knows are usually not the ones that matter most. The postcards, as I keep calling them. Lindisfarne is a postcard. This podcast is about what's underneath. And underneath the story of Vikings going west, raiding England, settling Iceland, reaching North America, there's another story, one that starts earlier, runs deeper, and involves the place I now call home. Sweden went east, not exclusively. Some went west, and we'll get to that. The Sutton Hoo helmet proves those connections ran deep, and the epic poem Beowulf, set in Scandinavia, mentions Swedish kings. The Western world knew who was here, but the main current, the dominant direction for the people leaving the coast around Stockholm, Gotland, and the Malaren Valley was east. They followed rivers into a continent with no coastlines. They became someone else, Rus, Varangians, and in doing so, they helped shape nations that still exist, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And they were doing it before Lindisfarne. So today we are going east. We'll follow the ships across the Baltic, up the rivers, through the portages, all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. We'll walk through Birka, Sweden's first town, and stand where the traders stood. We'll handle the silver that flooded back, more than 600,000 coins found so far, and that's just what's been discovered. We'll meet the Rus, the Varangian Guard, and the people who stayed home watching the horizon. And we'll ask the same question I've been asking since episode 2. What does it mean to be connected to a place this deep? Let me start with a sentence I've been turning over for months. Around 1,300 years ago, some 40 warriors from central Sweden and Gotland sailed across the Baltic Sea, landed on the Estonian island of Salme, and died there, violently in battle. Their bodies were placed carefully in 2 ships, weapons beside them, dogs and hawks buried alongside, game pieces, including a king piece from the strategy game Neffeltoffel, set into a dead man's mouth. And then the ships were covered with earth and stones and left. For more than 1,000 years, they lay there. The wood decayed, the bodies became skeleton, the iron rusted, but the soul preserved enough. In 2008, construction workers near the village of Salme, digging a trench for electrical lines, uncovered the first ship. What they found has rewritten the beginning of the Viking Age. I talk about the Salme ships in episode 7, when we were still in the Vendel world, but something happened since then, something that changes how we understood those warriors. In April 2025, exhibition opened up at the Wrak Museum in Stockholm. It's called Vikings Before Vikings, and it's built around the Salme finds. The exhibition was produced by the Salme Museum in Estonia, where the ships were discovered, and it broke visitor records there before traveling to Stockholm. And the headline is this: the larger of the 2 Salme ships could sail. That doesn't sound dramatic until you understand what it means. Earlier Scandinavian ships were rowed. Oars required many men, limited range, constant labor, and the energy of the crew. A sailing ship changes everything. You can carry more supplies, go farther, stay at sea longer, and you can cross open water without exhausting your warriors before you even arrive. The Salme ship is now considered the oldest known sailing Viking ship ever discovered. Dr. Johansson, the archaeologist and museum director at Wrak, puts it this way: This means the Swedish warriors were crossing the Baltic and raiding its shores far earlier than we imagined, and they were Vikings before the Vikings. Let that land. By the time the Lindisfarne raid happened in 793, Swedish sailors had already been crossing the Baltic under sail for at least 50 years, maybe more. The Salme burial is dated to around 750, maybe earlier. They weren't copying anyone, they weren't following, they were already out there. The warriors buried at Salme were not ordinary fighters. As we discussed in the last episode, plus a little recap, isotope analysis of their teeth reveal that many of them grew up in central Sweden and on Gotland. They were very tall for their time, several over 6 feet. These were robust individuals, and they carried richly decorated swords that marked them as elite. These were not fishermen. They were professionals, a warband, likely the highest ranks in their society before they died far from home. The blunt force trauma on their skulls, the sword cuts to their bones, the arm sliced clean through, this was close combat, brutal, personal, and possibly an ambush. But as I mentioned in the last episode, this is what haunts me. The bodies were not left in the field, they were brought to the ships, carefully arranged, and buried with ritual. Weapons position, animals included, that king piece in the mouth, a strategy game piece placed there deliberately. Someone performed this burial. Someone survived the battle or returned afterward and took the time to honor the dead. We really don't know. We don't know if they were allies who escaped or locals who decided to treat their defeated enemies with respect. The evidence can't answer that. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the Sami ships so powerful. They are not just artifacts, they are a question mark carved into the ground. Today, you can see these finds for yourself. The Vikings Before Vikings exhibition at Vrak Museum of Wrecks in Stockholm runs through October 2026. Combo tickets are available at the Vasa Museum as well. You can stand in front of the swords, the game pieces, the fragments of those warriors. You can see the king piece that someone placed in a dead man's mouth 1,300 years ago. Vrak is on Djurgården in Stockholm, easy to reach by tram or ferry. The museum tells the stories of people who, for 10,000 years, have depended on the Baltic Sea as livelihood, as highway, as battlefield, and as grave. And in that exhibition, you'll see proof that the Viking Age didn't begin with a raid on a monastery. It began with ships leaving Swedish shores, heading east into the unknown. The Old Norse word is Austrvegr, the Eastern Way. It's not one route, but many. A network of rivers, portages, and the trading posts stretching from the Baltic deep into the continental interior. Think of it as a highway system made of water, connecting Scandinavia to worlds most Europeans barely knew existed. The journey began in the archipelago around Stockholm, or it began on Gotland, along the coast of what is now eastern Sweden. Ships crossed the Baltic to the Gulf of Finland, entered the Neva River, reached Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest lake. From there, you had choices. Follow the Volkhov River south to Lake Ilmen, then the Lovat River. Then here's the hard part. You had to portage, drag your ship overland to reach the Dnieper River, which flows south to the Black Sea, or continue east on the Volga, which flows to the Caspian. Imagine that journey. Not weeks, months. A trip from central Sweden to the Black Sea couldn't be completed in one sailing season. The rivers froze in winter. You had to overwinter somewhere, wait for the thaw, keep going. And the rivers themselves were not friendly. Rapids could smash the hull, shallows could strand you. Territories controlled by people who didn't know you and had no reason to welcome you. Finnic tribes, Slavic tribes, nomadic groups whose language you didn't speak. But the rewards. The rewards were worth dying for. In the 8th century, something happened that reshaped the economic map of Europe. The Arabs conquered Spain and took control of the Straits of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean, which had once been under Roman control and then a Byzantine one, became harder to reach from the Atlantic. The western routes to the wealth of the east were blocked or dangerous, so the northern routes became an alternative. And the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was producing something the Vikings wanted desperately: silver. Not coins to spend at home. They didn't have that kind of economy yet. Silver was weight, bullion. You cut it into pieces and measured it on small folding scales, the kind found in countless Viking graves across Sweden. The Vikings called the Caliphate Sarkland, the Silk Land. Silk was one prize, spices, glass, gemstones, but silver was the foundation. Altogether, more than 600,000 Arabic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia. 600,000. But that number might be just the beginning. Recent research suggests that the actual figure could be far higher. Svein Gulbeck, a professor at the University of Oslo, has studied these coins for decades. His estimate: perhaps 1 billion silver dirhams followed into Scandinavia and the Viking world between 800 and 950. 1 billion. That estimate is based partly on the density of the coins found in Sweden, particularly on Gotland, which is in a class of its own for dirham discoveries. Swedish archaeology professor Martin Rundqvist put it this way: it seems if you send 25 detectorists onto the land of a farm in agricultural southern Sweden for 3 days and keep them from moving around too much, they will always find a few dirham coins. This wasn't occasional trade. This was a torrent. The coins themselves tell stories. They're called dirhams, silver, about 2.5 grams each, roughly the weight of a modern coin but thinner, inscribed with angular Kufic script, Arabic calligraphy, that most Vikings couldn't read. But they didn't need to read it. They needed to weigh them. Many of the coins found in Sweden show something interesting. They've been cut, snipped into pieces, sometimes a half coin, sometimes a quarter, sometimes just a fragment. This is called hack silver, and it was the Viking way of making currency. The value was in the weight of the silver, not the coin's denomination. You'd carry a small folding scale in a pouch, and then you made a transaction. You'd weigh out the silver, a fair system. Trust but verify. And they did verify. Many coins show tiny notches, test cuts, where someone gouged the surface to make sure it wasn't a forgery, wasn't base metal with a silver wash. Some of the silver was melted down and turned into jewelry. A fantastic find from Sigringsal outside of Larvik in Norway shows a half melted lump of silver with dirhams protruding from it. The Arabic coins were being recycled into new forms. Archaeologist Franz Arne Steiliger said, "I think they knew exactly where the finest silver came from. To find it, you had to go far into the southeast, not to France or England. So they went." Where can you see this silver today? The Swedish History Museum in Stockholm has an extensive collection, thousands of coins, many from Gotland. In fact, the museum's gold and silver room is one of the richest archaeological displays in Europe. You can stand there and look at tray after tray of dirhams stacked like they're waiting to be counted. The museum is on Narvavägen, easy walking distance from Östermalmstorg. If you go, Take your time with the coins. They are small, easy to walk past, but each one crossed continents to get there. On Gotland itself, the Gotland Museum in Visby has an extraordinary collection, including many dirhams from the famous Spillingshoard, the largest Viking silver treasure ever found, weighing 67 kilograms. 67 kilograms of silver buried in the ground and discovered in 1999. You can see it there. Real silver, real weight, real proof that the Eastern route changed everything. The people in the East didn't call them Vikings, they called them Rus. The origin of the word is debated, but the most likely source is Finnish, rutsi, meaning crew of oarsmen or rowing nation, a word for the people who came across the sea in ships, then hauled those ships overland between rivers. It's related to Roslagen, the coastal area of upland north of Stockholm, and to the older term Rodar or Roden, meaning seafarer. The Rus moved slowly but persistently into the landscape. They weren't conquering in the way we think of conquest, not with armies and sieges, at least not at first. They established trading posts, then settlements, then control. Staraya Ladoga, the gateway, founded in the late 700s on the Volkhov River near Lake Ladoga, archaeologists have found Scandinavian style houses, brooches, tools. This is where Vikings overwintered, repaired ships, waited for spring. Further south, along the Dnieper, they founded Konogord, the king's town. Today, we call it Kiev, and there's a story recorded in the Russian primary chronicle that in the ninth century, Slavic tribes who couldn't stop fighting each other sent a delegation to the Rus. They said, "Our land is rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." The Swedish chieftain named Rorik in Old Norse, answered the call. Historians argue about how much of this is legend. The primary chronicle was written centuries later and it served political purposes, but the genetic and archaeological evidence is clear. Scandinavian presence in what became Russia and Ukraine was real, sustained, and transformative. The name Russia comes from them. The word Rus referred initially to those Scandinavian warriors, then to the territory they controlled, then to the people living there. By the time of the Tsardom of Russia in the 16th century, the name had traveled far from its Swedish origins, but the thread was still there. I think about this when I look at a map. That line from Stockholm to Kiev, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, is not just geography, it's a story written in water. And I think about the men who made that journey. What did they carry? In their packs, in their minds? What did they miss? What did they find that they never expected? We have fragments of answers, grave goods, coin hoards, a few runestones in Sweden that mention the men who died in the East or in Greece. One of the most famous is the Piraeus Lion, now in Venice, a massive marble sculpture from the 4th century BC standing in Venice since the 17th century, but on its shoulders, carved in the stone, are runes, Swedish runes, from Vikings who served in Constantinople and carved their names into a monument they passed. Varangians carved this. That's all, but that is enough. Further south, at the intersection of Europe and Asia, lay a city that seemed impossible, Constantinople. The Vikings called it Miklagård, the great city. If you grew up in a longhouse on a Swedish fjord, if your world was timber and turf and firelight, arriving at Constantinople would have broken something in your mind. Massive stone walls, domes that seemed to float, gold everywhere. The wealth of the Roman Empire concentrated and preserved centuries after Rome itself had fallen. The city held perhaps 500,000 people, more than lived in all of Scandinavia combined. Markets with goods from every direction, churches that felt like mountains, emperors dressed in silk and jewels, surrounded by courtiers and eunuchs and priests. You couldn't take it by force. The walls were too strong. A chain stretched across the harbor to block ships, but you could serve. The Byzantine emperors had a problem. They didn't trust their own guards. Local soldiers had local loyalties, local connections, local ambitions. Too many opportunities for betrayal. They needed men with no ties to Byzantine politics, men who couldn't be bribed because they didn't speak the language well enough to negotiate. Men whose loyalty came from being strangers in a strange land. The Varangian Guard was born. The name Varangian comes from Old Norse varangi, meaning a sword follower or comrade. And from the late 10th century onward, these Scandinavian warriors formed the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. The Rus provided the earliest members. Treaty between Rus and Byzantium as early as 874 obligated Rus to provide men for Byzantine service. But the Guard was formally constituted under Emperor Basil II in 988, after Vladimir I of Kiev, himself descended from Swedish Rus, sent 6,000 warriors to Basil as part of a military agreement. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the emperor's shadow. They accompanied him everywhere. They stood outside his bedchamber, they fought beside him in battle, and they were feared for their ferocity, particularly their weapon of choice, the broad bladed Dane axe, which could split a shield or helmet of a man with one blow. The Varangians fought across the empire, in southern Italy against the Normans, in Sicily against the Arabs, and Syria in the Balkans at the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Virtually the entire guard fell around the emperor, and some of them, as I mentioned, carved their names into the marble at Hagia Sophia, the great church of Constantinople. You can still see them today, runes, Norse names, graffiti from men who traveled further from home than anyone in their families could have ever dreamed. The Guard continued for centuries. Over time, its composition changed. More Anglo Saxons arrived after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. But the Norse core remained. By the late 13th century, the Varangians were mostly assimilated into Byzantine Greek society, but the Guard itself lasted until at least the mid 14th century, and the impact on Sweden? Enormous. Swedish men that left for Constantinople in such numbers that the medieval Swedish law, the Västergötlagen from Västergotland, declared no one could inherit while staying in Greece, the Scandinavian term for the Byzantine Empire. They were trying to stop the emigration. Imagine that. So many men leaving for the East that lawmakers had to address it. Families waiting for sons who might never return, wealth flowing back, stories, ideas, and sometimes just silence. But here's the part that matters most for this podcast. For the story of Sweden itself. While all this was happening, the river journeys, the silver, the emperors, the guard, most people stayed home. They farmed, they fished, they raised children, they watched ships leave in spring and waited to see who came back. Birka was the center of this world. Birka lies on the island of Birka in Lake Mälaren, about 30 kilometers west of modern Stockholm. In the Viking Age, it was a gateway. The lake was still connected to the Baltic. Then, post-glacial rebound hadn't raised the land enough to cut it off. Ships could sail directly from Birka to the sea, and they did. Thousands of them. Between 750 and 950, Birka was one of the most important trading systems in Northern Europe. Merchants from across the Viking world gathered here. Goods arrived from everywhere: furs from the north, amber from the Baltic coast, slaves from the east, and silver, always silver, from Baghdad. Archaeologists have excavated more than 3,000 graves at Birka. 3,000. That's an extraordinary number for a single site. And those graves, in them, they have found evidence of that long reach. Coins from the Caliphate, a Buddha statue from northern India, silk ribbon from China, a woman buried with a silver Thor's hammer and a silver Christian cross, hedging her bets or maybe just valuing beautiful things regardless of their origin. Birka was not just a trading post, it was a meeting place, a place where the local and the foreign touched each other, where a farmer's daughter might see a man who'd walk the streets of Baghdad, where a warrior back from Constantinople might try to explain what he'd seen and fail because there were no words for it in his language. In 2021, the Birka Museum reopened with new exhibitions. You can visit today, take a ferry from Stockholm, Stroma, runs boats from Stadhuskagen during the summer season. The trip takes about 2 hours each way, crossing the same water the Vikings crossed. At Birka, you can walk the ancient fields. You can see the outlines of the town rampart, the harbor where ships unloaded, the gray fields where the dead were buried with their possessions. You can visit the museum and see the finds: the warrior woman from the 10th century buried with weapons, the elk men from the 8th century, the woman with the green cup from the 9th. The museum is open from May through September with varying hours. Admission includes a guided tour of the archaeological areas, and you can stand where they stood. And as you stand there, looking out over the water, you might feel what I felt when I visited. This was not a remote outpost. This was the center of a world connected, alive, part of something vast. The people who lived here didn't just watch the horizon, they were the horizon. For generations, Birka was where Sweden met the world. And then around 950, it was abandoned. We don't know why exactly. Possibly the land rise made the harbor too shallow. Possibly trade routes shifted. Possibly something else. The town faded. The graves stopped. The forest grew back. But the soil kept the evidence. And now, more than 1,000 years later, you can walk through it and wonder what it felt like to be the last person to leave. The Eastern route didn't just take warriors and traders away, it brought things back. Silver, obviously, more than we can count, but also ideas, new ways of seeing the world, questions about gods and belief. Vikings who served in Constantinople saw Christianity at its most spectacular: Hagia Sophia, imperial liturgy, the wealth of the church. They couldn't have been immune to it. Some converted, some brought the stories home, and gradually, over generations, the old gods began to retreat. There's a runestone in Sweden, U687, from Husta in Uppland. It's typical of the late Viking age, a stone carved with runes and ornament, raised in memory of a dead man. The inscription reads, Ragnvald had the runes carved in memory of Fastvi, his mother, Onum's daughter. She died in Ed. God help her soul. God help her soul. Christian language, carved in runes, the old script, the old form, but serving the new belief. That's the transition happening in stone. Not sudden, not violent, just gradual seepage. The Eastern route carried Christianity into Sweden as surely as it carried silver, not through missionaries and preaching, but through contact, through men coming home who'd seen something that made them think differently. And eventually, the temple stood empty and the churches were full. Birka is a beautiful place, but quiet. the kind of quiet that feels empty if you're not paying attention. There's a moment at Birka if you walk out past the grave fields toward the water and just stop where the landscape does something to you. The water is the same, the sky is the same, the horizon is the same. You are looking at the same view a Viking trader saw in 850 when he was loading his ship for a journey east. The same water that carried him to Ladoga, to Novgorod, to Kiev, to Constantinople. And you realize that history isn't a line, it's a layer. You're standing on top of it, but it's still there, still present, still pressing up through the grass. I mentioned in episode 7 that some of my closest ancient DNA matches come from individuals connected to this Baltic world. VK554, VK489, and VK482. People who lived and died in the same centuries we've been discussing, the same networks, the same ships. I don't know their stories. The evidence can't tell me. But talking about Birka, I thought about them, not as percentages or haplogroups or academic footnotes, as people. People who might have stood in that spot, looking out at the same water, wondering what was coming next. So here's what I keep turning over. The Swedish Vikings went east, not exclusively, but primarily. They followed rivers into a continent with no coastlines. They became someone else, Rus, Varangians, and in doing so, they helped shape nations that still exist. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. They brought back silver that changed their economy. They brought back stories that changed their imagination. And some of them came home rich enough to be buried with weapons and gaming pieces and everything they need for whatever came next. But most of them just came home or didn't. And the ones who stayed kept home living the way people had always lived here, watching the water, waiting, working the land. That's the part that connects back to where we started all those episodes ago, before Sweden had a name, before any of this was imagined. The land remembers, the water connects, and the people, whether they leave or stay, are always part of something larger than themselves. The Salme warriors didn't know they were rewriting history. They just knew they were crossing the Baltic and something went wrong. The Birka traders didn't know they were building a town that would still matter 1,000 years later. They just knew they had silver to weigh and ships to load and families to feed. The Varangians carving runes into the Hagia Sophia didn't know they were leaving a message for people like me to find. They just knew they were far from home and wanted to leave a mark. And that's what I keep coming back to, the ordinary humanity of it all. The way people across centuries are so different and so the same. They wanted security. They wanted meaning. They wanted to be remembered. And some of them were by accident, by archaeology, by sheer chance of what survives and what doesn't. Next time, we'll follow one of those threads further. What happened when the old gods met the new one? How Christianity arrived, not as conquest, but as seepage, slowly, quietly, until one day the temples were empty and the churches were full. We'll visit more places you can still see, more stones that still speak, but that's next time. For now, imagine a river somewhere that's now Russia. A ship being hauled over land between rapids, men sweating, swearing, speaking a language no one else understands. They're far from home. They don't know what is ahead, but they know what they're looking for, something that glitters, something worth the journey. They are not thinking about history, but history will remember them anyway. If you'd like to see some of the places and objects we've talked about today, I'll post those in the comments of this podcast and add it to the description so that you have more. Thank you for joining me on this journey east. If you'd enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast so you don't miss the next one. Following helps more people discover it and lets you know whenever a new episode comes out. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a different kind of history podcast, one that moves slowly, Ask questions and trust the listener. Please share it with them. Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard.